We are once again in a quiet period in the Ukrainian conflict. Last night, there were lots of reports about intense fighting near Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. There was apparently a major Ukrainian attack to try to capture the village of Klescheyevka near Bakhmut. I discussed that in some detail in my program yesterday. Last night, however, the Russians counterattacked. They seem to have regained most, if not all, of the territory that Ukraine had captured in its initial attack, and Klescheyevka itself remains stably, or so we're told, under Russian control. There have been a number of small claims by both sides about advances, but nothing that I can see of any significance. Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk regional government, he's obviously a pro-Russian official. He's claimed that the Russians, in a counterattack, captured one of the major fortified positions that Ukraine has in Marinka. Maybe true. He's made many claims about Marinka in the past. They've not always turned out as he said. But anyway, that's his latest claim. The Russians also claim that they've advanced 300 meters near Vuhledar, this bitterly contested town in the south of Donetsk region, which I think most people now acknowledge the Russians did try to capture in the winter. However, the attack was mismanaged and was pushed back with some losses. But anyway, the Russians seem to be inching backward towards Vuhledar again. And of course, they still control Pavlovka, the village to the south of Vuhledar, which they captured last autumn after intense fighting. And the Ukrainian General Staff itself appears to be admitting that the Russians have been making advances in the Kupiansk, Kremenaya area, right at the far north of the front lines. And of course, also, another thing that now happens regularly every day is that Russian drones and Russian missiles attack positions across Ukraine. Most recently, it's been principally Russian drones, Uranium-2 drones. The word is that they've now been modified and developed by the Russians and that they're now being produced in large numbers in a factory in Russia itself under license from Iran, and that these are being used to an increasing extent on the battlefields and are being used successfully. Meanwhile, there's also reports in the Western media that Ukraine is trying hard to find some means of countering Russia's deadly Lancet kamikaze drones, which have been proved such a devastating weapon on the front lines. But I would say that whatever progress Ukraine may be making in that direction, the Russians are likely to more than match. It seems they have a whole new series of kamikaze drones coming on stream, and no doubt we'll be seeing them on the battle lines also before very long. But overall, the fighting on the battlefronts has now ground to a standstill. In various places, Ukraine attacks, mainly with light infantry forces now. They seem to be trying to husband their armoured forces, their tanks and their armoured vehicles. The light infantry forces try to approach the Russian lines. The Russians respond with artillery, machine gun fire. Sometimes the Ukrainian troops do reach the Russian lines. They occasionally occupy trenches, Russian trenches. The Russians then counterattack, recover the trenches, push the Ukrainians back, and all the time continuously now, Ukraine continues to suffer very heavy losses. And this has now become the pattern of this offensive. Ukraine has at various times suggested that the major attack is still pending, that Ukraine is waiting for the moment when the Russian forces are so depleted that an attack becomes a possibility, an offensive breakthrough becomes a possibility. I think most people who have been observing this conflict for some time are now increasingly skeptical that that will ever happen. And the general view is that it's more likely than not going to happen, because if Ukraine has not committed most of its forces, which is debatable, by the way, Russia certainly has not. And as I've discussed in recent programs, all of the evidence is that Russian arms production, which rose significantly, increased very significantly this year, Putin says threefold, that next year the increases in production of Russian weapon systems are going to be at least as great. Now, coming back to the topic of Ukrainian losses, there's been a very interesting article which has been circulated by Jeff Roberts, whom I thank for the fact that he's provided us with this article. Anyway, there's been a very interesting article by a gentleman I don't know, someone called Noah Carl, and he's attempted to use this survey by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, this Ukrainian opinion poll, which I discussed some time ago, which said that 63% of respondents have acknowledged, Ukrainian respondents have acknowledged that at least one friend or close relative has died in the war. Anyway, he's tried to use this opinion poll to try to calculate at least a ballpark figure for Ukrainian losses. Now, it's important to say that Mr. Karl is not making any claims that the figures that he is providing are the correct ones. He's just engaging in a statistical exercise, a mathematical exercise, and he's using as his model opinion polling data, and that was taken during the pandemic, and the way it correlated from deaths, actual reported confirmed deaths during the pandemic. And he accepts that there are problems with this model, but anyway, it is a model, and he is using it, and he's using it to try to come to some general estimate of Ukrainian deaths over the course of the conflict. And I think perhaps it's important to stress that he's also not necessarily talking about battlefield deaths. He's including civilians in this number as well. Anyway, he reaches an upper figure, an upper level figure of 188,000. And I'm not absolutely clear what the lower figures would be if he sort of tweaks the numbers, the input numbers. But I get the sense that he thinks that it's certainly over 100,000, perhaps 150,000. So a range from 150,000 to 188,000. Now, let me repeat again, he is not saying that these are the actual numbers of deaths Ukraine has experienced during this war, but he does make the point that these figures, based on this survey, they do suggest that Ukrainian losses have been very much higher than has been acknowledged by the Ukrainian government and by the United States. He says that in May, I'm quoting from his article now, US officials told Fox News that 42,000 civilians and 20,000 soldiers have been killed. In June, the UN reported 9,000 civilians had been killed. In December, that's quite a way back now, the Ukrainian government reported that 13,000 soldiers had been killed. And he makes the point 188,000 is vastly higher than US officials' combined estimate from May. So as I said, there's lots of caveats, but for what it's worth, I thought this was an interesting study by somebody who's gone about their work carefully and who doesn't make excessive claims for the accuracy of this study. And we see that this person is coming up with numbers of Ukrainian deaths using these statistical models that are orders of magnitude greater than those which are acknowledged by the United States and by Ukraine. And of course, that takes us back to May, June. It's important to emphasize that the opinion poll by the Kiev Institute of the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, it's important to stress that their opinion poll covered a period that just fell short of the start of Ukraine's offensive. Ukraine's offensive began on the 4th of June, and my understanding is that this opinion poll closed, responses from respondents closed on the 5th of June. So it will not have included losses from Ukraine's offensive. Now, the Russians have given various figures for Ukrainian losses over the course of the offensive. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, reported to Putin some weeks ago that at least in the first few weeks, the first 3 weeks, Ukraine had lost 13,000 men killed and wounded over the course of the offensive. And he also said that the Russian Defense Ministry calculates its figures based on intercepts of Ukrainian communications. Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, gave very similar, though slightly different figures in the same meeting to Putin. And that was some time ago. There have been more losses since. One report has suggested that Ukrainian losses, Russian estimates of Ukrainian losses over the course of this offensive, including both dead and wounded, comes to around 20,000. Now, you can make of these figures what you will. I think that overall they're accurate. I would say that Mr. Karl's estimates correlate fairly closely with other studies that I have seen, and indeed with some of the numbers that the Russians have been producing, once one acknowledges that Russian Ministry of Defense figures are both dead and wounded, something which had not been clear from the outset. And it is clear that Ukraine is taking enormous losses, is suffering very, very badly as a result of this war. And we don't have figures from the Russian side, but we do have estimates of Russian losses from Media Zona and the BBC. They put Russian losses at around 22,000 or so, that was the last figure that I saw. They seem to be, those are dead, but Mr. Carl's figures are also numbers of dead. They seem to be orders of magnitude less than the deaths suffered by Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine is running short. It doesn't have a military industrial complex to speak of anymore. It's not able to produce tanks or infantry fighting vehicles or shells or bombs. The Russian air campaign makes sure that that cannot happen. It is now wholly dependent for its weapons supplies on the West, always an uncomfortable position for a country that is involved in this kind of war to find itself in. And of course, the question always comes back to how long and how successfully the West can sustain this support for Ukraine. And I'm going to suggest that the limiting factor for this offensive is not, as some people think, human losses, though those are extremely high, and that there are reports now that Ukrainian units, brigades, deployed on the front lines, especially on the southern front lines, are becoming increasingly demoralized and unwilling to engage in further attacks, and that some of them have had to be pulled back to the rear for in order to be reconstituted, in order for the losses to be made up by newly mobilized soldiers, many of whom have received only limited amounts of training. But anyway, the limiting factor I'm going to suggest is not going to be human losses. Ukraine still has large numbers of men it can call on and use to fill up the brigades and continue to launch attacks and continue to defend in various positions and locations. Now, I'm going to suggest that in terms of this offensive, it is going to be ammunition use. That is going to be the limiting factor. Here, we've had lots of data preceding the launch of the offensive from the United States, from the European Union. Turns out that US shell production has maxed out at about 30,000 rounds a month. That of the European Union has maxed out at around 4,000 rounds a month. And that is, if we are looking at a Ukrainian shell expenditure of 5,000 rounds a month, which is probably conservative for this offensive, that's around 7 days worth of shell use. Well, before the war, before the offensive, the Western powers made a major effort to pull together ammunition from all sorts of countries. 500,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition were provided by South Korea, supposedly loaned to the United States, but most people I assume, that they ended up in Ukraine. The United States, of course, will have chipped in more from its production, though some of that production will be needed by the US military itself, given the extent to which US arsenals have become depleted, and those of the US's European allies. And, of course, they've also tried to find ammunition in other places, in Pakistan, in Egypt perhaps, and it seems that the US's reserve stock in Israel, intended for use by the US military in the event of a conflict in the Middle East, that has been depleted as well. Its munition stock in Israel has also been depleted. So the United States has plundered its reserve stocks, It's plundered those of its allies. It's increased production. It's about doubled shell production. And there was guesstimates before the launch of the offensive, which I suspect were reasonably accurate, that in total Ukraine had been supplied with around 1 million shells for the offensive. Now, that brings us back to the complex subject of Ukraine's expenditure of shells. And various points in the conflict, we were getting reports that Ukraine was firing around 5,000 shells a day. I am going to guess that for the offensive at least, Ukraine has probably increased that number. If Ukraine has increased the number of shells it's launching to support its offensive to 10,000 rounds a day, then it has had a stockpile at the start of the offensive which would suffice to last for around 100 days. And by the way, that was about the length of time that the offensives in the autumn, the Kharkiv and the Kherson offensives, lasted before they finally ran out of steam. Now, it may be that Ukrainian shell expenditure is below that, which would of course prolong the amount of time that Ukraine could conduct its offensive. But bear in mind that if Ukraine reduces the number of shells it fires too much, then it will no longer have the ability to sustain, to support its offensive with artillery use, with artillery fire, and most people acknowledge that without support from artillery, an offensive really ceases to be practical. So I would have thought that Ukraine is obliged to fire at least 5,000 to 10,000 rounds of shells a day, simply to keep even the appearance of an offensive going. Now, the Russians, of course, are using many more shells than that. Nobody knows exactly how many, but their production is multiples greater than that of the West, as we've discussed many times on these programs. And, well, Putin has spoken about the Russians having at least 3 times as many shells as the Ukrainians do. And General Zaluzhny has been much more direct about this. He says that at times the Russians have launched 10 times more shells than the Ukrainians have done. So anyway, I am going to stick with this 100-day timeline. If we start at the beginning of June, it suggests that this offensive still has quite a long way to go, probably through July and August, but that unless some kind of breakthrough is achieved by then it will begin to wind down. It'll be difficult to sustain it beyond that, given shortages, ammunition shortages. Now, there may also be other limiting factors which I'm not taking into account. I've talked about shells, but of course, Ukraine is now increasingly reliant upon Western guns. M777s, Caesar howitzers, German guns, guns supplied by Poland, guns supplied by Britain. And these are not available in unlimited quantities. The amount of artillery, especially self-propelled artillery, that the West has been able to supply appears to be essentially maxed out, at least in terms of what the Europeans can supply. And there is another limiting factor as well, which is that when the West first started to supply artillery to Ukraine in the early summer of last year, there was an awful lot of talk in the West about how that would enable Ukraine to achieve a decisive advantage because Ukraine's guns, the West's guns, the Western supplied guns, outranged those that the Russians were using. You may recall there was an awful lot of discussion of this last year, and you must have noticed that one never hears about that anymore. Now, the reality, and here again I'm going to acknowledge my debt to Mr. Kinnair, the reality is that the Russians routinely work with a high-low mixture of artillery. So they have large numbers of relatively simple 152 millimeter guns. They don't have the longest range. The D-20 howitzer, which dates from the 1950s, being a classic example. They don't have enormous range, but the point is that they are designed to operate at lower pressures, and that means that the gun barrels have less wear. Western guns have longer ranges because they operate at higher pressures, and classically they use longer barrels. Now, the Russians do have artillery that can at least match that of the West, but traditionally they've done this at bigger calibers, 203 millimeter calibers, rather than 152 millimeter calibers, which presumably means, I'm not a physicist, that these bigger Russian guns also are able to achieve comparable ranges to Western guns, but at lower pressures. So they need less refits. They need less work to be the barrels run down. They have less wear, and the barrels need to be replaced and repaired at longer intervals. I would say that the Russians also have some newer guns, 152 millimeter guns, that do seem to have comparable ranges to Western 155 millimeter guns. They've recently, for example, brought into service, and it's apparently operating on the battlefield, a self-propelled 152 millimeter gun called the Matka, which is said to be equivalent to the French Caesar howitzers, which are typically very long range. But I suspect that these are, again, limited numbers of them, perhaps many more than Ukraine has Western guns. But the point is that the Russians classically always supplement these long-range, high-precision guns with very much larger numbers of cheaper, shorter-ranged guns that require less maintenance, less repair, whose gun barrels wear out at longer intervals. And of course, the thing to understand is that Ukraine has fewer guns, far fewer guns anyway, than the Russians do. It's never been entirely clear how many guns the West has supplied to Ukraine. Shoigu did give some numbers in that meeting with Putin, which was in the hundreds, but Russian numbers are certainly very, very much greater. The point is, when these guns need repair, they have to be trundled all the way back to Poland and Germany, to the NATO bases for repair, whereas the Russians can do their repairs much more readily because, of course, their massive military-industrial complex and their repair facilities are all located along much easier transit points, and some of them much closer to the front line. And we've already seen problems. We've already seen arguments between Poland and Germany about repairs to the Leopard 2 tanks. Poland says they can't repair the Leopard 2s, they have to go to Germany. There's been a curious argument over all of this. But anyway, my main point is that, of course, ammunition may be a problem, probably is a definite limiting problem. Gunware, problems with the guns themselves, their quantity, their ability to keep operating is probably going to be a bigger problem still, and that might also limit the extent to which this offensive can be kept up. Having said that, as I said, I'm going to stick for the moment with my 100 days guesstimate. I suspect, as I said, that around August, September, beginning of September, the ability to sustain this offensive will have been run through. Now, this brings me back to the topic about Ukraine keeping hundreds of thousands of men and tanks and machines in reserve, 100,000 men by some estimates, that they could launch into the battlefronts. There may be some truth in this, and undoubtedly there is. It's certainly the case that Ukraine hasn't committed all of its forces to this offensive. But it has committed a very high proportion of the hardware the West provided. 16 Leopard 2 tanks have been destroyed. At least more than a score, probably much more than that, of the Bradleys have also been lost, and perhaps at the Strikers as well. And the Russians also say that the Marders have been. So Ukraine probably has committed a bigger proportion of its Western supplied weapons than some of these claims about large numbers of weapons being held in the rear acknowledge. And it may be, it could be, that to the extent that Ukraine does have tanks and equipment in reserve, what is left of Ukraine's original arsenal of Soviet-era tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and similar tanks and infantry fighting vehicles previously supplied by the East European powers, the East European members of NATO. And this would be the last stock of such weapons that Ukraine has, and I think it would be a fairly desperate enterprise in that case if Ukraine were to commit that last stockpile of weapons to an offensive which wasn't achieving anything very much, given the difficulties of replacing these weapons. And I can't help but think that it might make more sense and might eventually be the Ukrainian decision to try and husband these weapons and these remaining troops instead. So anyway, we shall see. There have been predictions that, the big Ukrainian offensive would start in the second half of June. It didn't. We've had more predictions of big Ukrainian attacks in the run-up to the Vilnius summit. That is now 6 days away. Time for that is starting to run short. There have been bigger Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area, but they don't seem to have been successful, and they seem to be encountering more and more losses. Ukraine has acknowledged that its attempts to use drones large numbers of drones, fleets of drones, to try to make up for Russian air superiority. That hasn't really worked. Before the offensive, there was claims that when the offensive was launched, around 1,000 Ukrainian drones would be launched at one go to try to overwhelm Russian defenses. Up to this point, that hasn't happened, and one gets the sense that Russian electronic warfare systems are making that all but impossible, and Ukraine is starting to admit that it is losing the drone war, that more and more Russian drones are appearing, and that's making it increasingly difficult for Ukraine to match Russian capabilities in drones, which are improving all the time, even as Ukraine's own are becoming increasingly depleted. So, an offensive that still has some way to go, probably will continue in some form through July and August, but will then run its course. At which point, what happens? Well, Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky, have now been increasingly urgently demanding more weapons from the West. President Zelensky has now made actually, I thought, rather threatening series of comments in which he said that he knows the exact amount of weapons in Western stockpiles, and that West has abundant numbers of weapons, and all that it needs to do is to supply more of these weapons to Ukraine, and that will be enough to achieve a decisive outcome. It's a little bit like General Zaluzhny in his article, in his interview of a few days ago with the Washington Post, saying that the West has 2 to 3 times more fighter jets on Ukraine's western border than the Russians have fighter jets on Ukraine's eastern battle lines. And why can't he have some of them? He actually gave a number of 120, though he said that wasn't what he was asking for. Why can't he have some of them to conduct this offensive? And one gets the sense of growing recriminations on the part of Ukraine. There's also been angry comments by Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief, who is also back, by the way. He's now saying that whatever Vilnius decides on Ukraine's NATO membership is going to be very disappointing, and that Ukrainians must prepare for the fact that their aspirations are not going to be met by the West. And in fact, there's even talk now circulating in Ukraine, apparently, that they've now started to understand that they're not fighting any longer, as far as the West is concerned, to achieve victory over Russia. Ukraine, as far as the West is concerned, its only purpose, the only reason it is continuing to fight, is in order to put the West in some kind of position where it can negotiate with the Russians from a stronger position than might otherwise be the case. And of course, if this starts to take hold in Ukraine, if Ukrainians start to see and understand this, then I cannot help but think that more and more of them are going to start asking, why in that case are they being asked to sacrifice their lives for no better purpose than to improve not Ukraine's negotiating position with Russia, but the West's negotiating position with Russia. Now, there's been a very, very fine article by the historian Jeff Roberts, who's been one of the most important commentators about this war. It appears on John Menadew's public policy journal, Pearls and Irritations. But it very closely matches my own views. And first of all, he acknowledges that so far the counteroffensive has been a very costly failure, that expectations that the Russian troops would turn and flee have turned out to be completely wrong. He points out that even Ukraine's Western backers are now starting to develop their doubts, and Jeff Roberts makes the entirely valid point that irrespective of the final outcome of the current battles, the war of attrition with Russia, and let us be very clear, that is the war that the Russians have chosen to fight. They've chosen to fight this war as a war of attrition, and I will come to that, the consequences of that shortly. The war of attrition with Russia will go on, and that is a fight Ukraine cannot hope to win. These are Jeff Roberts' words. No amount of Western military aid can tilt the balance of power in Ukraine's favor. Russia has too many troops, tanks, planes, and guns. Russia's defense industry is outperforming Western arms manufacturers, and President Putin is well able to add to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers he has already mobilized and deployed. And Jeff Roberts refers to Strana, a Ukrainian daily newspaper, which he says provides outstandingly well-informed and impartial coverage of the war. By the way, I would agree with that. Strana is an indispensable source to anybody who wants to look at this conflict, taking it from a Ukrainian view, but a more balanced Ukrainian view than many of the others, which explains, by the way, why I believe it is not in particular favor with the Ukrainian government. But anyway, Strana also acknowledges that Putin's support in Russia, despite the Prigozhin affair, is solid, and Arestovich, this is also, again, I'm getting this from Jeff Roberts, Zelensky's former spokesman, has now apparently come out and made the point that I've made just a short time ago, that Arestovich has said that Ukrainians are shedding their blood for the sake of future Western negotiations with Russia. And Jeff Roberts makes the point that Putin, perhaps to the surprise of many people, still says that he's willing to sit down and come to some kind of negotiated settlement of this conflict, though I suspect it will be on very tough terms, not just for Ukraine, but for the West as well. But Jeff Roberts makes the point that however difficult a pill that is, both for Ukraine and the West to swallow, it will be a far less bitter pill than the one they might be obliged to swallow if the war goes on for very much longer, leading to more death, destruction, and defeat for Ukraine. My own view is that September now is becoming the hard timeline. If some movement is not made to get negotiations going before then, in other words, before the final failure of the Ukrainian offensive becomes impossible to deny, if that doesn't happen by September, then we're probably going to be looking at a similar scenario to Vietnam, where negotiations continued for years, eventually ending in what was for the United States a catastrophic outcome when the North Vietnamese army eventually marched into Saigon. Anyway, that's where I think this conflict is. As I said, I would guesstimate around 100 days for this offensive. There's still, as I said, July and August still to go. By September, if no breakthrough has been achieved, no decisive win has been obtained, it's going to be very difficult to keep this war on any kind of trajectory that might provide the West and Ukraine with some kind of face-saving outcome, a face-saving outcome for the West, an outcome for Ukraine, which ensures the country's survival. I think, as I said, they've got until perhaps the first week of September left. That's my own guess. Now, of course, there might be some things that could happen that might change this picture. I get the growing sense that enthusiasm for direct Western intervention in the war is waning, even as, by the way, some Russian officials like Vladimir Rogov are talking it up, but I think that's waning now. It looks as if the United States has cooled on the F-16s, and they're now saying publicly that the reason they've blocked, well, not saying publicly, but apparently their sources are now apparently saying that the reason that Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary's application to become NATO Secretary General, was blocked by the United States was because the United States was very angry with the way in which he tried to bounce the United States into supplying F-16s to Ukraine. Now that strongly suggests that the United States is cooling on the idea of supplying F-16s. I said in my programme yesterday that the sight of burning Bradleys might have diminished enthusiasm for sending F-16s, which might follow the same fate as that of the Bradleys. So, there we are. A war which is in no sense in stalemate. And this is another point I want to repeat, and one which has been made very well by Larry Johnson. A stalemate is a situation where neither side can win. This is not the situation in the war in Ukraine. Never has been at any time, but certainly since the Russians decided last September, following the Samarkand summits and the discussions that were taking place then, to commit to a mobilization, a military build-up, when they first started to put their military industries on something close to a war footing. From that moment on, the outcome on the front lines, on the battlefronts, points in only one direction, to an eventual Ukrainian defeat. It will be the Russians who will decide ultimately how great that defeat will be. Putin has floated the possibility of a return to Kiev. Other Russian officials like Medvedev have spoken in even harsher terms. We'll have to wait and see how all of that works out. But the longer this is left, the less time there will be for the West to try and find some kind of a compromise which the Russians might still feel is acceptable and better for them. Anyway, lots of other things have been going on in the world. There has been an Israeli attack on the Palestinian town of Jenin. It's attracted a great deal of attention. In my opinion, whatever its proximate causes, which have been many, the fact that Israel escalated in this way is a sign of Israeli concern that with the West's position, the US position in the Middle East, deteriorating following the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also the growing moves to settle the Syrian war, that the Israelis are becoming increasingly concerned about their own position. Their attempts to achieve some kind of peace treaty with Saudi Arabia have apparently gone nowhere, and it's looking as if the Abraham Accords, which they were able to achieve with some of the Arab states, have in effect frozen, that they've not provided Israel with the diplomatic breakthrough that they hoped that it would. And as I said, I've no doubt that this Jenin affair did have more proximate causes than this, but I do get the sense that Israel itself is becoming increasingly worried about its long-term position. And this is this has been shown up also by some comments by the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's now said that Israel is very unwilling to supply advanced weapons, Merkava tanks, Iron Dome type missiles to Ukraine, because it's worried that if it does supply them, and if the Russians capture them, they will share the secrets of these weapons with Iran. Now, that's not entirely a fanciful thought. There have been photographs that have been circulating in the Russian media over the last few hours of an almost or largely intact British Storm Shadow missile that was brought down by the Russians, who knows how. And apparently, undoubtedly, unquestionably, the bits of this missile have found their way to Moscow, to Russia. They're no doubt being poured over by Russian technicians. And there's no reason to doubt that the Russians will very soon share all they have found out about this missile, how it works, what it does, with their friends. And that could very well, of course, include Iran, as well as China and other countries like that. So we can see that there is some force to what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying. But I suspect also that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is whatever else he is, he's a very skilled diplomat. He understands that with this deteriorating international situation for Israel, it has become even more important for Israel than before to maintain some kind of dialogue with the Russians, not to burn bridges with Moscow completely, as might be the case if Israel began to supply large amounts of weapons to Ukraine. And there must be concerns also in Israel about what's going on in Syria as well. There's now been reports that the Syrian army has been launching more offensives on a fairly limited scale in northern Syria. This in advance of the talks, the negotiations with President Erdogan of Turkey that everybody expects will take place before very long. But there's also been incidents involving the Russian military and the US military in Syria. And there was a report that came out from the United States that Russian Sukhoi 35 fighter jets have intercepted in northern Syria 3 American Predator drones. This is an incident, this is very like that incident that took place some months ago over the Black Sea, when a Russian Sukhoi 27 fighter jet intercepted an American drone and in fact caused it to crash into the sea. We haven't heard much about that incident, but the probability is that the Russians retrieved the wreckage of that drone and have again pieced it together and have shared its secrets with their allies and friends. But anyway, it does seem as if the Russians are taking a more aggressive position towards the American military in Syria, and this is happening at the same time as the Syrian military is taking steps of its own. So the Israelis must be looking at all of this, and they must be getting increasingly concerned, as they must also be becoming increasingly concerned about rumours of big Russian arms supplies. Some have said up to 60 Sukhoi 35 jets to Iran. So I suspect that deep down, maybe not the proximate explanation for the Jenin affair, but it is probably the underlying one. Israel's becoming uncertain about its position. And that might have geopolitical consequences, because a worried Israel, worried about its own security, might eventually decide that he has no option but to start to talk more seriously to other countries than the United States about its own security. Russia, China as well. They might not be quite as sympathetic to Israel as the United States has been. They might not be as supportive of Israeli policies as the United States has been. But given the receding power of the United States in the Middle East, it might be what the Israelis eventually decide that they have to do. And of course, speaking about China, there's been a very interesting development as well. Now, I have discussed the extraordinary gyrations in US-Chinese policies. The US, after the balloon incident, worked night and day to try to get the Chinese to agree to receive the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in Beijing. And eventually the Chinese did agree to receive him, and he did eventually come. And he had a very difficult reception when he did eventually get there. But he was ultimately received by Xi Jinping, and conditions seem to be set fair for a summit meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping, perhaps in October. And then President Biden wrecked everything by making all kinds of comments, which it's clear to me he insisted that the rest of the US government adopt, about Xi Jinping being a dictator, about China being in an economically difficult situation, about China and Xi Jinping having been humiliated in some way by the balloon incident. And anyway, that caused the good work, if that's the right word for it, that Blinken achieved in Beijing to unravel. And you get the sense that other people in the United States have been very concerned about this. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, especially so. She must be worried about the overall stability of the world economy if relations between the United States and China continue to deteriorate. And she's now heading towards Beijing in an effort to repair the damage. And the Chinese have agreed to meet her, but they have refused to meet, apparently with someone else. And that is the EU's External Affairs High Representative Josep Borrell, He was due to travel to Beijing next week. And apparently the Chinese have, without explanation, called off his visit. So we see that the Chinese, for their part, are in an increasingly tough-minded mood. We see that in the Middle East, there's signs of US allies, US's key ally, Israel, perhaps beginning to become nervous about the situation, its own situation. And we see a deteriorating situation, at least from a Western point of view, in Ukraine, with an offensive that for the moment is going nowhere. Now, I repeat again, the point I've made in recent programs. To my mind, there is only one suitable topic for discussion by the NATO leaders when they meet in Vilnius. That topic for discussion is how to resume negotiations, open up talks, restart a dialogue with President Putin in Moscow. I saw that there was an article in Newsweek which acknowledged that President Putin's position has actually been strengthened as a result of the Prigozhin affair. There's still some people who are trying to argue otherwise and making points about the fact that Prigozhin is flying backwards and forwards between Belarus and Russia as he tries to wind down his businesses in Russia. I don't think there's anything more to it than that, actually. But anyway, some people are trying to make hay out of this. But the fact is, President Putin is going nowhere. The Russian military is building up in Ukraine. Ukraine's offensive is failing. The Russian central bank has now issued a statement in which they say that they expect that Russia's GDP levels at the end of this year will be the same as they were at the end of 2021. In other words, the recession that was triggered by Western sanctions in 2022, by the end of this year, that will have been completely overcome. The Russian central bank has also, by the way, said that they are unfazed by the recent decline in the ruble. I not only think that they are unfazed, I think they have probably played a role in orchestrating it. I suspect that they wanted to push the ruble down in order to improve Russia's external trade balance, and in particular its account balance, at a time when oil prices have started to rise. They want to make even more money by selling, by gaining more receipts for the rubles for the oil, ruble receipts for the oil they sell. But anyway, this is a complex subject. I'll come back to it perhaps later. But anyway, in the meantime, as I said, the economy, the Russian economy, is stable, inflation is low, output is rising, President Putin is securely in power. There's no real option but to talk to him, given that the war in Ukraine is now clearly set on only one trajectory, which is for Ukraine to lose. Anyway, whether the Western leaders do that in Vilnius, I don't know. There are, of course, alternative voices. Mr. Tobias Ellwood, a British MP, Conservative MP, former British military officer. I believe that he is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, but I'm not absolutely sure about this. Anyway, he's given a rather excited interview, at least he came to me as rather overexcited, in which he said that Britain is now involved in a war in Europe, it's time that it became directly involved and didn't leave it all to Ukraine, and that apparently he was floating in various places ideas about martial law being imposed in Britain and all that. Well, I don't think that will be very welcome in Britain, even within political circles. But of course, if you want to go down that route, with all that implies, World War III and all that, well, you can do that, but more rationally, more sensibly. They need to get together in Vilnius. And they need to recognize that the Ukraine venture, is turning into a debacle, and look for some way to restart some kind of dialogue with Moscow. People in Kiev, Zelensky, Zaluzhny, Reznikov, Podolyak, Budanov, all of these people, they may not like that. People like Mr. Elwood might not like it either. But to my mind, in rational terms, there is no realistic choice. Anyway, that's where my program today ends. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you want to, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.